Welcome back. Mike Allen of Axios wrote yesterday that there are two kinds of, quote, collusion delusion. One, the belief among President Trump's most ardent supporters that no collusion indictments means the president's witch hunt claims have been vindicated. And a second, he wrote, the bitter reality that this probe has spawned many others stretching far beyond Russia. So it's delusional to think it simply ends with no collusion. Joining me now to look at some of the legal implications of the Mueller report, Ari Melber, MSNBC's chief legal correspondent and host of The Beat on MSNBC, and former senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg. Ari, I want to start with you. The no new indictments with the conclusion of the Mueller report was greeted as a moment of vindication by the president's most ardent supporters. Why shouldn't they feel good, at least about that fact?
They can feel somewhat good because it shows that Bob Mueller did not find a chargeable election conspiracy, not against Donald Trump and not against people around him. So that tells you something. The reason why I think President Trump has remained quiet and most people are still waiting is the report could ultimately surface a lot of other bad material about poor judgments or even attempted crimes without charging them.
Chuck Rosenberg, principal conclusions. Okay, you've worked in the Justice Department. You know how different people interpret different phrases. What's your sense of what Bill Barr means by that?
Yeah, he promised it quickly, Chuck, and so it strikes me that he meant by that it would be reasonably high level, meaning all the stuff we want to see in the report, all the interesting details, probably not.
You expect a very narrow scope here.
Reasonably narrow because he promised it so quickly and because there's a lot to work through before you can decide whether all that other stuff can be public.
Obviously, the big question is, it's collusion versus obstruction. And can you come to a collusion conclusion, apologies for that alliteration, if obstruction took place, Ari?
You definitely can shed more light on what were the reasons that Donald Trump seemed to repeatedly interfere with these probes, instruct people to mislead or lie. Was there something underlying? And the theory had been, well, that might be this election conspiracy, collusion. It might also be other related problems that national security officials care about or the Congress cares about that are not what has been called collusion. For example, if somebody high in the government owes a foreign power a lot of money and that has corrupted foreign policy, that's a big deal. But that might not be the kind of thing a special counsel charges.
All right. We have an array of issues in public that we've covered that have led to some people believing an obstruction charge won't actually even be that difficult. You've got his suggestion to Comey to drop the Flynn probe. You've got the firing of Comey when he cited the Russia thing, ordering the White House counsel to fire Mueller, calling for the Attorney General to fire Mueller, dangling the possibility of pardons. This is the public record. Do you expect Mueller, do you expect him to be so focused on his charge that he lists the evidence without making a conclusion, meaning he'll list all of the obstruction evidence, and basically, Chuck Rosenberg, it's up to you to conclude whether that's obstruction?
Yeah, there's a difference between describing what you find and characterizing what you find.
And what do you expect him to do?
I worked for the man. I expect him to describe what he found. I expect him to describe it in detail, but not to characterize it, because that becomes something in the eye of the beholder. And so it will be for us and for Congress and for journalists to decide whether what Mueller has found amounts to obstruction. He will describe it. He will lay out the evidence. He will give you an evidentiary foundation. I believe it'll be for others to characterize.
That leads to the political challenge, I think, for the House Judiciary Committee, and I think that's why you heard some hesitance in Gerald Nadler.
Absolutely. Ultimately, the materials that come from Bob Mueller to the Congress, whether that is sooner or later, are going to put forward questions of whether this president abused his power in such a way that the Congress wants to do something about it. And that's significant even in the absence of collusion indictments. So you have both things happening, Chuck. On the one hand, people who had long assumed or hoped that this president clearly, illegitimately obtained the presidency, those individuals, it's time to acknowledge there's no chargeable collusion. And yet, on the other hand, the House is going to have to consider the facts presented about potential obstruction.
Let me get to executive privilege here.
Sure.
Because this, to me, is this rabbit hole. How do you know what to assert as executive privilege without reading the report?
Right. So they have to read the report. There's this
So who reads it?
There's this odd tension here, right? The Justice Department is part of the executive branch. The president runs the executive branch. The Attorney General of the United States reports to the president. If there's stuff in that report, put aside classified information and grand jury information and all those other categories, if there's stuff in that report over which executive privilege can be genuinely, legitimately asserted, someone's going to have to see it before they can make the assertion. I assume that means White House counsel is going to go through the report and see whether or not an assertion is valid. Remember, though, privileges are qualified. They can be overcome. They've been overcome in the past, and it may be overcome here.
Gerald Nadler seems to think that the White House has no case here. Do you think they have a case?
It's a very hard argument to make that Bob Mueller got things from people through a lawful process, never overruled.
Voluntarily, though, and the White House's lawyers had always said they reserve the right.
They say they reserve the right, but this was a lawful process. No judge ever rejected the investigative tools. And so short of something very special, for example, something Donald Trump put in his own written answer subject to his own, as you say, qualified statement that he later wanted to revoke it, it's hard to see the bulk of this being subject to executive privilege.
Chuck, you have a way of reminding us of things we're not focusing on here. What is a part of the Mueller report that you think is going to be more important to people that we're not discussing?
Well, there are parts of it that are really important because remember, at essence, it's a counterintelligence investigation, right? What did our adversary, Russia, do to us in the 2016 election, and what do they hope to do to us down the road?
Is that investigation wrapped up? The counterintel? Does that mean that that's also wrapped up too, the counterintel investigation?
I'd be surprised if that were wrapped up, and here's why. This is an ongoing struggle between Russia and Western democracies. And so they didn't stop doing what they do when Bob Mueller finished his report. Right. And so whether it's Mueller or the counterintelligence division of the FBI or the rest of our intelligence community, this is a serious ongoing concern.
But at some point, the Justice Department has to be a part of ending the cloud over the presidency and letting the Congress or everyone else make judgments.
All right. Maybe we'll get something this afternoon. Ari Melber, Chuck Rosenberg, thank you for sharing your expertise with us this morning. Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and then click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.